She didn't knock. She never knocked. Evelyn Hart pushed open the gate to Colt Mercer's land like she owned it, because her chicken certainly thought she did. And Colt stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching that small red hen scratch circles in the dirt of his freshly planted south field like it was auditioning to destroy everything he'd spent 3 weeks building. "That bird," he said slowly, "is on my property." Evelyn didn't even blink. She wanders. She trespasses. She's a chicken, Mr. Mercer. And somewhere in that valley, a legend was about to be born. If you're watching this from your city or town, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you stay until the very end, I promise you, this one's worth it. Hit like, settle in, and let's begin. The morning Colt Mercer turned 34 years old, he woke up before the sun did. Not because he had somewhere to be, not because anyone was waiting on him. He woke up early because that was simply the shape of his life. Sunrise, coffee, work, silence, sleep, repeat. And he had worn that routine into the boards of his cabin floor the same way a man wears grooves into a saddle. Deep. Permanent. His. He pulled on his boots in the dark and stood at the window of the single-room cabin he'd built with his own hands 5 years ago, looking out at the valley below. Silver Creek ran along the base of the hill in a thin silver thread, catching the first pale light of morning in a way that made it look almost like something worth painting. Colt was not a man who painted things. He was a man who fenced them, planted them, repaired them, and managed them. The valley was beautiful in the way that useful things are beautiful, not for being pretty, but for being real. His land ran roughly 200 acres from the creek to the tree line on the north side, and from the old wagon road in the east to the stone ridge that marked the property boundary on the west. He knew every inch of it. He knew which patches drained slow after rain and which froze hard in November. He knew where the elk liked to move through in September and which fence posts the deer had a habit of testing with their hindquarters. He knew his land the way most men know their own names, without thinking, without effort, without needing to be reminded. The south field was freshly turned. 3 weeks of early mornings and stiff evenings had gone into preparing that ground for planting, and Colt had finally gotten the seed in the day before. Good seed. Expensive seed. The kind of investment that required faith in the weather and faith in his own back, and he didn't have much left of either. He poured his coffee from the pot he kept on the stove's edge. Black, always black. He had never once understood why a man would ruin good coffee with cream, and carried it outside to stand on the porch and watch the light come up. This was his favorite part of the day, not because it was beautiful, though it was, because it was quiet, because nothing had gone wrong yet. He was on his second sip when he saw the chicken. It was a small bird. Red-brown feathers, alert black eyes, a posture that suggested it had never in its life considered the possibility of doing something wrong. It moved through the south field with complete confidence, its head bobbing with every step as it worked its way through the freshly turned rows, scratching up seed with a focused enthusiasm that Colt found genuinely impressive in the way that a man might find a tornado impressive. Not with admiration, but with a kind of stunned, helpless recognition of power. He watched it for a full 10 seconds. Then he set down his coffee cup on the porch rail and walked down the steps. He crossed the yard, moved through the gate, and made it about 30 feet into the south field before the chicken noticed him. It looked up. It tilted its head in that sideways bird way. Then it went right back to scratching. "Hey," Colt said. The chicken scratched. "Hey." The chicken moved 3 inches to the left and found what appeared to be an extremely interesting patch of dirt. Colt spent the next 15 minutes attempting to herd a single chicken out of his south field, and he was not going to admit to anyone, ever, how difficult that turned out to be. The bird had a gift for moving in the exact direction he wasn't expecting. Every time he thought he had it cornered against a fence row, it ducked under his arm and appeared somehow behind him. He was sweating by the time he finally got it moving in roughly the right direction, and he was not in a good mood when he reached the fence line that separated his property from the neighboring homestead to the west. The fence had a gap in it, a clear, obvious gap, 2 posts leaning inward toward each other like old men sharing a secret. The wire between them sagged low enough that a confident chicken could walk right over it without much effort, which was, apparently, exactly what had happened. The neighboring property belonged, as of 7 months ago, to one Evelyn Hart. Colt had met her twice. Once at the general store in town when she'd arrived and introduced herself to anyone who would listen, which had turned out to be nearly everyone. She had that kind of voice, not loud exactly, but clear. The kind of voice that didn't need to compete with anything because it simply arrived and settled in and stayed. The second time had been at the Grantham's place for a Sunday supper in October, where she'd argued with old Hector Grantham for 45 minutes about whether rotating cattle grazing patterns would improve the South pasture, and she'd been right, which Hector had eventually admitted with the expression of a man who'd swallowed something sour. She'd bought the old Fielding homestead, fixed the cabin roof herself, according to Ruth Calloway, who knew everything about everyone within 15 miles. She had 2 horses, a small garden she'd already extended twice, and apparently one very ambitious chicken. Colt looked at the gap in the fence. He looked at the chicken, which had stopped at the fence line and was staring up at him with what he could only describe as accusation. "That," he said, pointing at the gap, "is her problem." He didn't go over there that day. He spent the morning replanting the rows the chicken had disturbed, working on his knees in the dirt, picking out individual seeds from the dust where he could, and making educated guesses where he couldn't. It took 2 hours. It put him in the kind of mood where he didn't trust himself to have a civil conversation with anyone. By afternoon, the chicken was back. He found it in the south field again, cheerful as ever, operating with the confidence of a creature who had found a place it liked, and saw no compelling reason to leave. Colt stood at the edge of the field for a long moment. Then he went and got his hammer and a handful of fence staples and walked to the property line. He repaired the gap. It took 20 minutes, set the posts back plumb, retightened the wire, added 2 extra staples on each side for good measure. It was solid work. He was proud of it in the small, quiet way he was proud of things he did well when no one was watching. He carried the chicken back to the other side himself. The next morning, it was in his south field again. He walked the fence line and found a new gap 15 yards north of where he'd made the repair. The wire had been, he wasn't sure. The post looked like it might have been kicked, or maybe it was just old. But there was a gap, and there was the chicken, and there was Colt standing in his south field at 6:30 in the morning with a coffee cup going cold in his hand and a feeling in his chest that was working its way from irritation toward something more serious. He repaired that gap too. The following morning, the chicken appeared from a direction that didn't make sense. Colt walked the whole fence line, all 40 yards of shared property boundary, and found a third gap. This one in a low spot where the wire had pulled free from a post that had heaved up through winter frost. The chicken couldn't possibly have... Actually, yes. The chicken could have. The wire was low enough there that even Colt, looking at it, had to admit it wasn't much of an obstacle. He repaired it. This went on for a week. On the 8th day, he went over there. He crossed onto Evelyn Hart's property through the gap he'd been fixing, purely as a matter of convenience, not as any kind of statement, and walked up the path to her cabin. It was a good cabin, he noticed, despite himself. The roof she'd patched was solid-looking, the new shingles a different shade of gray than the old ones, but laid correctly with good overlap. The porch was swept clean. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall in neat rows, already showing early green against the dark soil, and he could see she'd put in a cold frame for starting seedlings. Practical. The woman was practical. She was in the garden when he arrived, on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of soil on her left cheek that she didn't appear to know was there. She looked up when she heard his boots on the path, and she sat back on her heels and squinted at him in the morning light. Evelyn Hart was not what you'd call a conventional beauty, not in the way the word got used in the dime novels that Ruth Calloway ordered from back east and passed around the valley. She had a face that was interesting rather than soft, with sharp dark eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently set at the edge of saying something. She wore her dark hair pinned up and out of the way in a way that suggested she'd made a decision about it early in the morning and hadn't thought about it since. She was tall for a woman, with a kind of physical ease that came from working hard, and she looked at Colt without any particular surprise or alarm, as though she'd been expecting him and was mildly interested to see if he'd say anything worth hearing. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Miss Hart." He stopped at the edge of the garden. "You have a chicken." "I have several chickens." "You have one that thinks it lives on my property." A beat. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Not a smile. Matilda is adventurous. Matilda. He repeated the name with the flat tone of a man who did not think chickens required names. She's curious. It's a personality trait. It's a trespassing trait. He paused. She's been in my south field 8 days in a row. I've replanted that ground twice. Evelyn's expression shifted slightly. Not to apology exactly, but to something adjacent to it. Consideration. I didn't know she was going that far, she said. I've been watching the west side. The west side is fine. It's my fence on the south boundary. Your fence has several gaps in it, which I have been repairing. Then she finds new ones. Evelyn stood up from the garden, brushing dirt from her knees. I'm not sure what you want me to do about the natural curiosity of a chicken, Mr. Mercer. I want you to contain her. I do contain her. She doesn't stay contained. Then build better containment. Then build a better fence. They looked at each other. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, but charged. The way air gets before a thunderstorm, with a sense that something was about to happen and neither party was entirely certain what form it would take. I will, Colt said finally. I absolutely will. He walked back to his property. He built the fence that afternoon, the best fence he'd put up since the north pasture perimeter the year before. New posts, properly set and braced. Wires stretched tight, every connection double stapled. He worked until the light went gold and then orange, and then started going away entirely, and when he was done he stood back and looked at it and thought that no chicken on earth was getting through that without significant architectural planning. The next morning he found Matilda sitting on top of a fence post, looking down at the south field with what he could only interpret as professional assessment. She had not, technically, breached the fence. She was sitting on it, on the post. At the corner where the wire met the wood, where there was, he now recognized, just enough of a platform for a small, determined bird to, "Oh, come on," Colt said. Matilda blinked at him and ruffled her feathers in a way that managed to convey something extremely close to dignity. He went back to Evelyn Hart's property. Again. She was at the water pump this time, filling a bucket, and she looked up when he crossed through the gate with an expression that he was already beginning to recognize, that careful neutrality she wore when she was working to keep her face from doing something she'd rather it didn't. "Did the fence work?" she asked. "She's sitting on top of it." The neutral expression cracked, just for a moment, less than a second, but he saw it. The corner of her mouth went up. Her eyes changed in a way that people's eyes do when something is funnier than they want to admit. "That," she said carefully, "is a creative solution. That," Colt said, "is a problem. She's not on your property. She is planning to be. You can't charge a chicken with intent, Mr. Mercer." "I would like," Colt said, with measured and precise frustration, "for your chicken to stay on your side of the fence." "And I would like," Evelyn said, with equal precision, "for you to understand that I cannot control the specific ambitions of individual livestock. She's a chicken. She's Matilda." They were close to the same height. She came up to maybe his chin, maybe. And she held his gaze without blinking, without backing up, without doing any of the things that most people did when Colt Mercer used that particular voice. His sister had once told him he had a voice that made people feel slightly guilty, even when they'd done nothing wrong. It had never worked on Evelyn Hart, not once. "I'll move her pen," Evelyn said after a moment. "I can shift it to the north side, closer to the cabin. It won't keep her in completely, but it'll be a longer walk back to your fence." It was the closest thing to a concession he was going to get. He could see that. "Fine," he said. "Fine," she agreed. He walked back home. By Friday, Matilda had found a new path to the south field that went around the back corner of Colt's property through a section of old fence he hadn't thought to check, crossed 30 feet of scrubland, and entered the south field from an entirely different angle. Colt sat on his porch that evening and looked at his land in the failing light, and thought about the fact that he had spent 2 weeks of his life engaged in active tactical conflict with a chicken and was losing. Then he thought about the expression on Evelyn Hart's face when he told her Matilda was on the fence post. That half second when the neutral cracked and the real thing came through underneath. He poured himself a second cup of coffee and did not examine that thought any further. The water situation came up in May, and it was a more serious matter than Matilda. Silver Creek ran along the base of the valley and then bent northeast through the lower edge of Colt's property before continuing east past the Grantham land. There was a secondary channel, more of a drainage ditch really, that had been dug sometime in the previous decade to direct water toward the Fielding homestead during the dry months. Evelyn had inherited it along with the property. The problem was that the channel ran through a low corner of Colt's land, and when he'd cleaned it out the previous autumn, removing the beaver debris and deadfall that had been partially blocking it, he had, without fully thinking through the downstream consequences, improved its flow dramatically. What this meant in practice was that in May, when the creek was high with snowmelt and the channel was running full, a portion of the runoff was crossing the southwest corner of Colt's property and sitting in a wet low spot rather than making it through to Evelyn's land. He'd noticed it, but hadn't yet addressed it. He had a lot of things to address. He'd been planning to get to it. He found out that Evelyn had noticed it when she showed up at his gate on a Tuesday morning in May. He was in the barn, working on a harness that needed new stitching, when he heard boots on gravel and looked up to find her standing in the barn doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that was several degrees past the usual careful neutrality. "My garden well is running low," she said. He set down the harness. "Good morning." "The channel isn't delivering full flow. Something's backing up on your side." He picked up the harness again for something to do with his hands. "I know. I was going to fix it." "When?" "When I got to it." "My seedlings are 2 weeks from needing—" "I know, Miss Hart. I said I was going to fix it." People say things. She came further into the barn, which he hadn't invited her to do. "I'm not accusing you of doing it deliberately. I'm pointing out that it's a problem. I'm aware that it's a problem." "Then why—" "Because," Colt said, with exaggerated patience, "I have 40 head of cattle, 2 fields in active planting, a pasture fence on the north side that's been hit by elk 3 times this spring, and a chicken systematically dismantling my south boundary. I have been getting to things." A pause. He watched her recalibrate, not backing down exactly, but slotting that information in somewhere. "I can help clear it," she said. "I don't need help." "I didn't say you needed it. I said I could provide it. It's my land. It's water that affects both properties. That makes it—" "My land," he repeated. She looked at him for a moment with those sharp, dark eyes. Then she said, "Fine. When specifically will you address it?" He told her Saturday. She said she would be at his fence line at sunrise on Saturday to check. He said that was not necessary. She said she'd be there anyway. She was there at sunrise on Saturday. He had started on the channel at first light, partly because he'd told her Saturday, and he was a man who kept his word, and partly, a small, honest partly, because he didn't want her standing at his fence line waiting on him. He had half the blockage cleared by the time he heard her boots in the grass on the other side. She climbed the fence without asking permission. He looked up from the drainage ditch. "I thought you were going to check from the fence line," he said. "I decided to come help." I know you don't need it." She was already down in the ditch on the upstream side, pulling debris out with her gloved hands and tossing it clear. "Consider it self-interest. My water." He could have argued. He started to. Then he looked at the volume of work still ahead of him and did a calculation that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with time. They worked in silence for most of an hour. Not uncomfortable silence, working silence, which is a different thing. The kind of silence where 2 people are focused on the same problem and there's nothing much to say because the problem itself is doing all the communicating. She worked hard, he noticed. Not in a showy way, just steadily, without complaint, doing what needed doing without being told what that was. When the channel was clear and the water was moving through clean and free, they climbed out of the ditch and stood on the bank, brushing muck off their gloves. The sun was fully up now, warm on the back of Colt's neck. "Thank you," he said. The words felt slightly foreign in his mouth. He didn't use them often, not from laziness, but from a habit of handling things himself that made gratitude rare. "You'd have gotten it done either way," Evelyn said. "Yeah, but not until Thursday." She did that thing again, that almost smile that went all the way to her eyes before she thought to stop it. "Your seedlings are safe then," she said. "My seedlings were never the ones at risk." "No?" A beat. "Mine were." "I know." They stood there for a moment in the way that people sometimes do after working together on something. The particular pause of two people who have just shared effort and are figuring out what that means, if anything. "Coffee?" Colt said. It came out before he'd considered it, which was not typical. He was a man who considered things. Evelyn looked at him. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't name. Surprise, maybe, or the management of surprise. "I have to get back," she said. "Right." She climbed back over the fence. At the top, she paused. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Yeah." "Matilda's been staying closer to home this week." A beat. "Thought you should know." Then she dropped down to her side and walked back through the grass toward her cabin. Colt stood by the drainage channel for another minute. Then he went back up to his cabin and poured himself coffee and sat on the porch and thought about nothing in particular. Summer in the valley was brutal and beautiful in equal measure. The way things are when they don't much care what you think of them. The heat came hard in July, the creek dropped to half its usual depth, and every rancher and farmer within 20 miles of Silver Creek spent the season in a state of exhausted vigilance, watching the sky for rain, watching the grass for fire, watching their animals for the particular dullness in the eye that meant the heat was getting to be too much. The town itself, which was less a town than a loose agreement between a general store, a livery stable, a saloon, a church, and about 30 families spread over a wide radius, had the social quality of a small community under pressure, which is to say that everyone was in everyone's business, everyone knew everything about everyone, and the arrival of Evelyn Hart the previous autumn had given people something to talk about that was considerably more interesting than crop yields and creek levels. A woman running a homestead alone was not entirely unheard of in the territory, but it wasn't common. A woman who did it with the kind of competence and complete indifference to other people's opinions that Evelyn had demonstrated was something else. Ruth Calloway approved of her, which in that valley was roughly equivalent to a formal certification of character. The Grantham brothers thought she was too direct for comfort, which Evelyn had been informed of and responded to by being, if anything, slightly more direct. The ongoing situation between Evelyn Hart and Colt Mercer had become a reliable topic in the general store by midsummer. "He repaired that fence line 3 times, said Pete Dawson, the farrier, who lived a mile east and seemed to collect other people's news as a hobby. 4 times, corrected Della Sims, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store and had heard the number directly from Evelyn herself. "And she moved the pen twice. The chicken still gets through. Colt came over there on a Saturday," offered Tom Wheeler, who seemed slightly in awe of this. "Worked on the drainage ditch together." "He asked her for coffee," said Della. "Did she go?" "She did not." A collective pause that managed to convey both disappointment and a specific kind of knowing interest. "He's stubborn," said Pete. "She's stubborn," said Tom. "They're both stubborn," Della said, which was generally agreed to be the most accurate assessment. None of this reached Colt's ears, which was partly because he didn't spend much time in town, and partly because the kind of person who would have told him seemed to correctly sense that he wouldn't receive the information well. The horse incident happened in late July. Colt's gelding, a gray quarter horse named Brannigan, who was a reliable working animal and no trouble whatsoever most of the time, got through a gate that Colt had not latched properly and spent an estimated 3 hours grazing in Evelyn's garden before anyone noticed. 3 hours. In a kitchen garden that Evelyn had been tending since March. Colt was in the north pasture checking fence when he heard her voice carrying across the distance with a clarity that suggested she was not in a good mood. He couldn't make out the words from that distance, but the tone was unmistakable. He followed it to the garden and arrived to find Brannigan standing in the middle of what had been a very fine row of pole beans with a somewhat guilty expression, and Evelyn standing 6 feet away from the horse with her hands on her hips, looking at the damage with the specific stillness of a person who is controlling themselves with concentrated effort. Brannigan had also taken a significant interest in the tomatoes. "Brannigan," Colt said. The horse looked at him without apparent remorse. Colt took the gelding's halter and led him out of the garden. He closed the gate behind him. He tied Brannigan to the post outside the fence. He came back to stand at the edge of what remained of the garden and looked at the damage beside Evelyn. It was bad. Not catastrophic. Most of the main beds were untouched, and the cold frame had escaped entirely, but the pole beans were gone, the tomatoes were significantly set back, and a row of late-season greens had been flattened. "I'll replace the seeds," Colt said, "and the plants. I'll go into town tomorrow." Evelyn said nothing. She was still looking at the garden with that controlled expression. "It was my gate," he said. "My fault. I'll make it right." "I know you will," she said quietly. "That's not what I'm—" She stopped. She pressed her mouth together. Then she crouched down and picked up one of the downed tomato plants, setting it upright in the dirt with a care that made him feel, somehow, worse than her anger would have. "I started these from seed in February, in the cabin, by the window, before the frost was even done." He stood there with nothing to say that would help. 6 weeks, she said. "I counted the days until I could put them out." "I know." She looked up at him then. Not with anger. Anger would have been easier, honestly. With a tiredness that was also something else, something more complicated. "People say they'll make things right," she said. "Then they're busy, or they forget, or what they replace it with isn't quite—" She stopped herself again. "I'm not saying that about you specifically. You're saying it about someone." A pause. "My husband," she said, finally. "Former." She went back to the plant. He was very good at promises. It was the first time she had mentioned him. Colt had heard, as everyone had heard, that she was widowed, that she'd come west alone, which meant something had ended badly or simply ended. He hadn't known the details and hadn't asked, because asking people things was not a natural habit of his. He crouched down beside her, not touching anything, just lowering himself to the level of the damage. "I'll be in town when they open tomorrow," he said. "I'll bring back what I can. If it's too late in the season to replant some of it, I'll bring extra from my stores come harvest." She looked at him, sideways, at close range, in that evaluating way she had. "You don't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." She nodded once, the way people nod when something has been settled that they didn't expect to be settled in a way they could accept. He went to town the next morning. He came back with tomato starts from Della's cold frames. Good ones, better than he'd hoped for at that time of year, and bean seed and a flat of the late greens. He replanted alongside Evelyn for 2 hours, neither of them saying much, and when it was done, the garden looked imperfect and patchy and like it had survived something, which it had. "They might make it," Evelyn said, looking at the new tomatoes. "Weather holds, they'll be fine." "You don't actually know that." "No, but it's what you say about tomatoes." She looked at him, and this time she let the smile come through properly. Not the half-second version, not the almost version, but a real one. It changed her whole face, that smile, made it softer than her natural expression suggested it could be, and warmer, and he filed that away somewhere without deciding why. "Thank you," she said. "For this?" "You're welcome," he said. And it didn't feel foreign in his mouth this time. Autumn came to Silver Creek like a slow exhale, the grass going gold, the aspens turning in the upper valley, the mornings sharp, and the afternoons still warm enough to work without a coat if you were moving. It was Colt's favorite time of year, harvest and preparation both, the season that always felt most honest about what the land was and what it asked of you. He and Evelyn had developed by September something that neither of them had a name for and neither was inclined to name. It had evolved from pure antagonism through what could generously be called armed neutrality to something more practical and less easily categorized. They consulted each other on things now, quietly, without ceremony, in the way of neighbors who have learned that certain problems on shared boundaries require shared solutions. She'd told him about a blight she'd seen on the Harmon property 3 miles east, and he'd been able to take precautions in time. He'd warned her about a broken wheel rut in the wagon road that she might not have known about until she drove into it. They had not had coffee together. He had not been on her porch. She had not invited herself further than his garden gate. But there were conversations, more of them, and longer, and with a quality of ease that was different from the quality of their early exchanges, though the argument was still there, present as a wire in the current, because they still argued. They argued about the drainage channel when the fall rain started and the flow changed direction slightly. They argued about the property line on the northwest corner, where there was genuine disagreement about where the old survey markers stood. They argued about whether Brannigan or Evelyn's mare Duchess had damaged a section of shared fence. That one went on for 3 days and ended in a draw that neither of them was fully satisfied with. The difference was that now the arguments ended. Before, they'd simply reached a temperature where both people stopped talking from exhaustion. Now there were actual endings, compromise reached, information exchanged, problem addressed, even if no one was entirely happy about it. It felt like progress of a kind that Colt couldn't quite define. The Grantham boys noticed. Della Sims absolutely noticed. Ruth Calloway, who noticed everything, told her Tuesday sewing circle that Colt Mercer had stopped by Evelyn Hart's property no fewer than 3 times in September for legitimate frontier neighbor-type reasons, and that Evelyn had been observed bringing something wrapped in cloth to his gate, which upon investigation turned out to be half a pie. "Apple," said Ruth, who considered this significant. "He bakes?" someone asked. "She baked," Ruth said, with the air of someone presenting evidence at a trial. The pie had been delivered in the context of a conversation about the northwest fence corner. Evelyn had explained the pie as what she had extra, which Colt had accepted without question, because accepting it without question was easier than the alternative. He had eaten it over the course of 2 evenings and thought it was excellent, and had not told her so because by the time he saw her again, they were arguing about something else and the moment had passed. He thought about mentioning it. He forgot. He thought about it again. He was aware, in September, in the particular way a man becomes aware of something he's been trying not to look directly at, that the situation with Evelyn Hart was, he wasn't sure what word to use. Interesting was too small. Complicated felt like an avoidance. Uncomfortable was wrong in the specific direction. It was uncomfortable in the way that some things are when they fit too well, and you're not sure what to do with that. He thought about her face when she'd talked about the tomatoes, the tiredness in it, and the thing underneath the tiredness. He thought about the way she'd handed him a cup of water when he'd been working in her garden after the horse incident, without asking if he wanted it, just handing it to him, and the complete absence of any kind of performance in the gesture. He thought about the fact that she was the most straightforwardly difficult person he'd encountered since his father, and also somehow the person he found most worth the difficulty. He did not examine any of this too carefully. He had work to do. He had cattle to rotate and a barn roof to prep before winter and 40 acres of harvest to manage. He had a life that was full and functional and required his complete attention. He told himself this on a Thursday in September, standing at the fence line that divided his south field from her west pasture, watching the late afternoon light come golden across the valley and the creek running low and clear below the hill. He didn't know that she was watching from the other side until he heard her voice. "You're going to stand there long enough, and Matilda is going to use you as a landmark." He turned. She was at her own fence, 20 yards away, looking at him with an expression he'd gotten better at reading, dry amusement with something underneath it that she wasn't offering for inspection. "Harvest looks good," he said. "Better than last year." She came toward the fence slowly, hands in her jacket pockets. "Your south field came back clean. Good seed. You replanted that whole section twice." Not a question. "Yeah." She reached the fence and leaned her arms on the top rail, looking out at the valley with him. The same view. They stood like that for a moment. "I'm going to fix the northwest corner this weekend," she said. "I figured out where the old markers are. I found one on my side, too. I'll bring it Saturday." "All right." The light kept coming. The creek kept running. Somewhere on her property, Matilda was conducting whatever private operations Matilda conducted when no one was watching. "The pie was good," Colt said. A pause. She didn't look at him. "I know," she said. "I meant to say." "I know that too." Another pause. "Next time," he said, "I'll bring the coffee." She looked at him then. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatic, not obvious, but real. The way a door opens a crack to show light. "Saturday," she said, "after we fix the corner." "Saturday," he agreed. He walked back to his cabin in the evening light and did not overthink it, which took some effort. On Saturday, they fixed the corner. It took 3 hours and ended in a genuine and mild argument about post placement that was resolved by a compromise that both of them found slightly unsatisfying, which meant it was probably correct. Then they had coffee. She sat on the top rail of the fence between their properties, with a cup in both hands, and he leaned against the post on his side, and they talked, actually talked, not just argued, about the valley, about what the winter looked like, about her plans for expanding the garden in the spring, about a horse sale in Billings he was considering. The conversation had the texture of talking to someone who was both easy and interesting, which was a combination that Colt's life had not previously offered him in great supply. When she left, Hopping down from the fence and walking back toward her cabin with her jacket collar turned up against the evening cool, he stood at the fence for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He was not going to say what was happening here, but he wasn't going to pretend it wasn't happening either. That felt, for now, like the honest position. And Colt Mercer was, whatever else people said about him, a man who tried to stay honest with himself, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was starting to look an awful lot like something he wasn't ready for. The valley went gold and then brown, and then the first hard frost came down from the mountains in October, and Colt split wood and prepped the barn and turned his cattle to the south pasture for the late grazing. He watched the smoke from Evelyn's chimney in the mornings and knew she was doing the same things he was, the same pre-winter calculus of wood and food and shelter and preparation, and there was something in that parallel, in two people on either side of a fence doing the same work in the same season with the same stakes, that he found unexpectedly comforting. Matilda, for the record, was considerably less active in the cold months. Small mercies. Winter came to Silver Creek and settled in, and held, and Colt Mercer kept his routine: sunrise, coffee, work, silence. But the silence was different now. Not empty. Just waiting. And he was beginning to understand, in the careful way that stubborn men begin to understand things, what it was waiting for. He just wasn't ready to say it yet. And that, as it turned out, would cost him. Winter in Silver Creek was not romantic. Anyone who told you otherwise had not spent one there. The cold came off the mountains in the night and settled into the valley like something with weight, and by morning it had worked its way into every gap in every wall and every joint in every bone. Colt's cabin was solid. He'd built it to last, not to be pretty, but there were mornings in January when the water in the pitcher on his washstand had a thin skin of ice across the top, and the only reasonable response was to get the stove running hard before you did anything else. He developed a habit that winter he didn't particularly analyze. Each morning, after the stove was going and the coffee was on, he'd look west through the window toward Evelyn's property. Not at anything specific, just at the smoke from her chimney. It appeared reliably, thin and gray against the white sky, usually within 20 minutes of when his own chimney started. 2 stoves in the same cold morning. It told him what he needed to know without requiring anything of him, and he found a kind of comfort in that which he couldn't have explained to anyone and therefore did not try. The first week of January brought 3 days of wind that drove the temperature down far enough that Colt's north pasture water trough froze solid overnight, and 2 of his older cows stopped eating in a way that made him watch them closely for 4 days before they came right again. He spent those days in a state of low-grade anxiety that manifested as increased silence and an unwillingness to be more than 100 yards from the barn at any given time. On the 4th day, he was in the barn with the older cow he'd been most worried about, a roan named Margaret, which he denied naming, when he heard boots on the frost-hardened path outside. He turned to find Evelyn standing in the barn door in a coat that was clearly built for function over everything else, her breath making small clouds, holding something wrapped in canvas. "I heard one of your cows was off," she said. He looked at her. "Who told you that?" "Pete Dawson saw you from the road on Tuesday and mentioned it to Tom Wheeler, who mentioned it to Ruth, who told me yesterday." He was going to have to accept that this was simply how information moved in this valley. "She's coming back around," he said. "Both of them." Evelyn came into the barn and looked at Margaret with the direct, assessing look she gave most things. She'd worked cattle before. He'd figured that out over the fall, piecing it together from things she said and the way she moved around animals, confident and without wasted motion. "What's in the canvas?" he asked. "Molasses and bran. If she's off her feet in the cold, sometimes you can get them interested with—" "I know," he said. A pause. "Right." He almost said, "But thank you," and stopped himself, because what he felt was something more complicated than gratitude, and he didn't want to investigate it in the barn in January with Evelyn Hart 3 feet away and his hands in a roan cow's halter. "Leave it," he said. "I'll try it." She set the canvas on the workbench and looked around the barn with the calm interest she brought to most places she entered, taking inventory without comment. Her eyes went to the hayloft, the stall construction, the way he'd hung the tools on the west wall. "Good layout," she said. "I built it myself." "I know you did. Not flattery. Observation." He tried the molasses and bran mixture that afternoon. Margaret ate most of it. By the following day, she was back at the hay with something approaching her normal enthusiasm. He did not tell Evelyn this directly, but when he saw her at the fence line at the end of the week, he said, in passing, "It worked." And she nodded once without making anything of it, and that was that. That was how things went between them through January and February. Parallel, proximate, careful. They helped each other in the specific and practical way of people who understand that pride has a cost in frontier winters that no one can really afford. When her smaller outbuilding took damage in a late January windstorm, a section of roof sheeting pulled up and bent back. Colt was there the next morning with tools before she had to ask. When his well bucket split and he was hauling water from the creek until he could get a replacement, she offered hers with no comment, and he used it without ceremony. These were not grand gestures. They were the accumulation of small ones, and small ones are sometimes harder to undo. February brought a stretch of milder weather that felt like a trick, and probably was. And during one of those false spring afternoons, Evelyn was on a roof patching the sheeting where Colt had temporarily fixed it, because she'd decided to do the permanent repair herself rather than wait to pay for help she couldn't easily afford, and she was 3/4 done and doing fine when she misjudged a patch of frost that had stayed in the shadow of the chimney. She didn't fall far. 5 feet, maybe 6, onto the woodpile stacked along the cabin's north wall. She wasn't seriously hurt, one bruised rib that made breathing interesting for 2 weeks, a cut on her hand that she wrapped herself, a spectacular bruise along her left side that she mentioned to no one. She sat on the woodpile for a moment in the cold, taking stock of the damage, and then she climbed back up and finished the roof because the patch still needed to go in and wasn't going to wait on her discomfort. Colt found out about it 3 days later from Ruth, who had found out from Evelyn's neighbor on the east side, who had seen her on the roof, and then not on the roof, and then back on the roof, in a way that concerned him. By the time Colt had the full story filtered through 3 people, he knew it was probably less dramatic than it sounded, and probably more than Evelyn had let on to anyone. He went over there the next day on the pretext of a question about the property survey. He didn't actually need answered urgently. He stood at her kitchen table while she made coffee and watched her reach for the cups on the high shelf and saw the way her left side moved, or didn't move, specifically, the small compensations a person makes when they're protecting something that hurts. "You fell off the roof," he said. She set the cups down. "I slipped. Off the roof. I finished the repair." She turned to face him with the kind of level look that she used when she was waiting to see if he was going to make something of a thing. "The patch is solid." "I'm aware. I looked at it when I came through the yard." "Then why bring it up?" "Because you fell off a roof," he said, with more feeling in his voice than he'd planned, "and apparently told no one, and have been walking around." He stopped. He made himself use a quieter register. "Are you hurt?" The question landed differently than the argument had. She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes, and some of the readiness went out of her posture, just a fraction. "Bruised rib," she said. "Maybe 2. They're healing." "Did you see the doctor?" "It's a bruised rib, Mr. Mercer. There's nothing a doctor does for that." He could confirm it's not. "I've had bruised ribs before." A beat, then quieter. "I know what they feel like." He wanted to ask how. He didn't. He'd learned over the months that there were edges on Evelyn's history that she'd tell him about when she decided to, and pushing before that only made things worse. "All right," he said. She poured the coffee and they sat at her kitchen table. The first time he'd been inside her cabin, he realized, though he'd been to her door and her garden and her fence line enough times to have lost count. The inside was like her, practical and without excess. Everything placed where it was useful rather than where it looked best. There were books, though, more than he'd expected, stacked on a shelf she'd built into the wall beside the stove. He found himself reading the spines sideways. "You can look at them," she said, watching him not look at them. "I wasn't." "You were." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Take one if you want. Bring it back when you're done." He pulled one out, a history of the territories, dense and small-typed, the kind of book that rewarded patience. He read the first page standing up while she drank her coffee and didn't say anything about it. "I'll bring it back," he said. "I know you will." He took it home. He read it over the following 2 weeks. He brought it back and they had a 20-minute argument about whether the author's account of water rights disputes in the territory was accurate. Evelyn thought he'd oversimplified. Colt thought she was giving too much credit to the settlers' side in the early land claims. And it was one of the better arguments he'd had in years, because she actually knew what she was talking about, which he found more satisfying than agreement would have been. March came in cold and went out colder, and then something shifted and April was possible. The thing about spring in that valley was that it required work before it rewarded anything. The thaw turned the low fields to mud, the creek rose fast and uncertain, and every fence line and drainage channel needed to be walked and assessed before planting could begin. Colt was 3 days into that process when he found a section of his east pasture fence down. Not just sagged, but flat on the ground, a long run of wire dragged off the posts by what looked like a tree limb that had come down in the February windstorm and lain there, slowly pulling the wire down through the freeze-thaw cycles until it gave. 30 feet of fence, down. His cattle were in the south pasture still, so there was no immediate crisis, but it needed to go back up before he moved them. He was hauling posts when Evelyn appeared at the edge of the pasture in a way that had become, over the winter, so natural that he registered it without particular surprise. "Your east fence is down," she said. "I'm aware. I can see it from my north field. I'm fixing it." She came over the remaining fence into the east pasture and looked at the damage. He waited for her to offer to help and prepared his response, which was going to be along the lines of, he had it, and she should probably— "Hand me that post, driver," she said, already reaching for it. He handed it to her. They spent 4 hours on that fence. She was good at it, efficient, unhurried, with the solid competence of someone who had set a lot of posts and didn't need instruction. He found himself working in a rhythm with her that was comfortable in a way he hadn't expected and wasn't going to remark on. "You've done this before," he said around the second hour. "My father ran cattle," she said. "Eastern Oregon. I was the oldest and the only one who'd do it without complaining." "Older than who?" "3 brothers." She drove the post driver down with her full weight behind it, and the post dropped another 2 inches. They were all charming and completely useless at fencing. Were they charming generally? When they wanted something. A beat. Like most charming people. He thought of the former husband she'd mentioned once and not since. He didn't ask. "My father ran cattle too," he said, "farther south. I came up here when he sold the herd. Didn't want to work for someone else's operation." "So you built your own?" "Yeah." She looked at him sideways, that assessing look. "Alone?" "Yeah." "You didn't want a partner?" He stretched a length of wire to the new post and started stapling. "I didn't know one worth having." She was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to driving the next post and didn't say anything else about it, which was the right call, and he appreciated her for making it. By the time they finished the fence, the light was going late and gold, and they stood in the pasture with the work done and dust and mud on both of them, and the particular tiredness that is also a kind of satisfaction. "I owe you," he said. "You've helped me enough times this winter," she said. "Call it even. I helped you with a water channel and a roof that was my horse's fault. And I helped you with a sick cow and 1/2 mile of fence posts." She pulled off her work gloves and tucked them in her jacket pocket. "We're probably even, Colt." She'd used his first name before, a handful of times, usually when she'd forgotten herself in the middle of an argument. This was different. This was just a sentence and his name in it like it belonged there, and she either didn't notice the shift or was making a decision not to acknowledge it. He made the same decision. "Even then," he said. They walked back to the fence line between their properties in the last of the afternoon light, and she went to her side and he went to his, and he stood there for a moment watching her cross the grass toward her cabin with her jacket collar up and her boots muddy from the pasture work. And he thought quite a few things, actually. He let himself think them in the privacy of his own pasture in the dusk, with no one watching, and then he went home and made supper and did not think about them anymore. Spring opened up and the planting came on, and they were both too busy for anything but the work. But the winter had changed something in the texture of how they moved around each other. Less negotiation, less performance. More of what it actually was, which was 2 people who had decided, without saying so, that they were in each other's orbit and who had stopped pretending that was accidental. Matilda, for her part, continued to find creative approaches to the Southfield fence. In April, she developed a new strategy involving the low branch of a cottonwood tree that grew within reaching distance of the fence post on Colt's side, and spent several mornings perched there assessing her options before Colt moved the branch with a handsaw and a sense of genuine exasperation. Evelyn saw him doing it from her north field and shouted across the distance, "She'll just find another way!" And Colt shouted back, "I know." And that was a complete conversation, and both of them knew it was also something else. Summer came again, and with it the kind of problems that the frontier kept in reliable supply. The water rights dispute that June was more serious than the drainage channel issue from the previous year. It involved the Harmon property upstream, which had been sold in the spring to a man named Vernon Schott, who had arrived with money, opinions, and a plan to divert a section of Silver Creek for a larger irrigation project on his north acreage. The problem was that Schott's diversion, if he built it where he was planning to, would reduce flow to both Colt's South Channel and the main water access that Evelyn's property depended on in the dry months. Colt found out about it when Pete Dawson mentioned it at the general store, and he drove out to look at where Schott was planning the diversion, and he was in the middle of assessing the situation when Evelyn appeared on the road behind him. "Ruth told you," he said. "Ruth tells everyone everything," Evelyn said, dismounting and coming to stand beside him at the proposed diversion site. She looked at the creek and the bank and did the same calculations he'd been doing. He can't do that. He thinks he can. Does he have water rights filed? He bought the property with the upstream rights. The question is whether those rights extend to restructuring the flow in a way that impacts downstream users. Her voice was precise and certain in a way that meant she'd already thought this through. He doesn't. Not without filing new use claims and getting sign-off from the downstream holders. Which includes us. Which includes us, Colt agreed. They looked at each other. "I assume," Evelyn said carefully, "that you're planning to contest it." "I was planning to go talk to him first." "Talking to Vernon Schott is like talking to that tree." She gestured at the nearest cottonwood. "With less useful result." "Have you met him?" "I was at the Grantham dinner when he introduced himself to the valley. He explained cattle management to old Hector for 40 minutes. She paused. "Hector has been running cattle here for 30 years. Colt thought about that. "We could file a joint objection with the county land office. If we're both listed as affected downstream users, it carries more weight than separate filings." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, not considering whether she wanted to. He could see she'd already decided that, but considering what it meant to do it together. Formally. With her name next to his on an official document, whatever they'd been building, quietly and without discussion, over the past year and a half. "All right," she said, "joint filing. I'll draft the language if you look it over." "I'll look it over," she said, and corrected extensively. "I'm counting on it." And this was how things were between them by the second summer, easy and difficult and necessary, the way the best arrangements usually are. They filed the joint objection. Schott pushed back. There were 2 months of back and forth with the county office in Billings, and one tense meeting at the general store where Schott made the mistake of dismissing Evelyn's portion of the argument with a gesture that suggested he didn't consider her a serious party to the dispute, and she corrected that impression in front of Pete Dawson, Tom Wheeler, Hector Grantham, Della Sims, and Vernon Schott himself, with a precision that Colt found genuinely impressive, and that Pete Dawson later described to Ruth Calloway as the most complete dismantling I have ever witnessed. Schott modified his diversion plan to avoid the downstream impact. Their water was safe. After the meeting, walking out to where their horses were tied, Colt said, "You didn't need me in there." "I know," Evelyn said. "Then why the joint filing?" She untied Duchess and checked the cinch before answering. "Because you're downstream too," she said. "Your water matters just as much as mine, and 2 voices carry differently than one." She mounted up and looked down at him from the saddle. "And because we're better at this together than separately, which you know perfectly well." He stood there with his horse's reins in his hand and looked up at her. "Yeah," he said, "I know." She rode ahead, and he followed, and the valley opened up ahead of them on the road home, wide and gold in the late afternoon, and he kept a pace behind her the whole way back because that was easier than riding beside her and having to do something about what was on his face. The town had its opinions, of course. It always had opinions. They filed papers together, Della told Ruth. Official papers. With the county office in Billings. Ruth considered this with the gravity it deserved, and he drafted them. And she corrected them extensively. Ruth nodded. That, she said, is as close to a love letter as that man is capable of writing. Whether or not she was right about that, it is true that Colt went home that evening and sat on his porch in the dark for longer than usual, listening to the creek run and the nightbird settle and the particular sound that a valley makes when it holds two people in the space between them. He knew what was happening. He wasn't an unobservant man. He'd known for a while. The knowing wasn't the problem. He'd built a life on a foundation of things he could manage himself, fix himself, decide himself, and he was good at that life. It worked. It held. Bringing someone into it meant the possibility of it not working, not because of anything specific, but because that was what happened when you depended on something. Things you depended on could fail, could leave, could turn out to be less than what you'd thought, or more than you knew how to hold. His father had been a man who kept his feelings the way he kept his tools, useful, maintained, put away when the job was done. He'd learned that early and learned it well. He wasn't sure he knew how to unlearn it. So he sat on the porch, and the night went dark and deep, and the smoke from Evelyn's chimney was invisible in the darkness, but he knew it was there, and he thought about courage in the way that people think about things they're not sure they have enough of. The harvest celebration was 6 weeks out. He knew she'd be there. He knew everyone would be there, because that was how it worked. The whole valley, once a year, setting down the weight of the season for an evening. He was not, in September, thinking about the harvest celebration in any particular way. He had not been, he told himself, working up to anything. He was, mostly, trying to figure out how to be honest about something he'd been dishonest about for a long time, which is a harder problem than it looks. Matilda found a new